Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the honor of serving as director of Roosevelt House on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, who has devoted so much in terms of attention and resources to this house. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight, and a particular pleasure to welcome our C-SPAN audience as well, as Roosevelt House continues its spring season of book talks. And it's a delight to welcome back an old friend, Tom Mallon, for his second visit here, having last presented on his novel of Ronald Reagan, Finale. Now, I routinely begin these introductions, especially before a captive national television audience, by reminding our listeners and our attendees about the extraordinary history of this house and its occupants. But I do want to make clear that I'm not doing that to advocate for our amazing guest to do a fictional approach to Franklin Roosevelt, who has been subjected, I think, to enough fictionalization over the years. But then I needn't worry too much, because so far Tom has devoted his attention almost exclusively to Republicans. Richard Nixon, the aforementioned Ronald Reagan, and now in the new book that brings us together this evening, George W. Bush. And maybe we should be grateful that FDR doesn't fit into his requirements. But then again, FDR was able to work his magic on so many writers that I tremble as I try balancing my enthusiasm for FDR with my attempt to remain immune to freedom from fear about Tom Mallon's pen. But just to remind you all, because it seems like months since I've had the opportunity to do so, that this is, of course, the house where Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, together with FDR's strong-willed mother, who built it as a gift for them, lived for the 25 years leading up to his presidential inauguration. Sarah not only gave the eastern house to her son and daughter-in-law, she built the western portion of this double-sized townhome for herself, and once everybody moved in, she made sure the walls of Jericho fell and she had access to both sides of the house 24/7, all but driving Eleanor out of the house and into public service, for which we are eternally grateful. And we always pause to remember that in the final months of 1932 and the first few months of 1933, what is called a genuine national emergency. Did you all not get that? A genuine national emergency. FDR and his brain trust met here to create the foundations of the New Deal, including Social Security, which was created in this house. Tom, I'm not trying to intrigue you with these stories, I promise. So clearly history is as complex as current events are, and as we live through our own truth is stranger than fiction epic, it's a relief to have the guiltless pleasure of turning the pages of a Tom Mallon historical novel, guaranteed to be shrewd, ripped from the headlines, but from the inside looking out, always keenly observed, funny, daring, engaging, and ultimately satisfying. And he's done it again with Landfall, a novel of the Bush White House, which the New York Times Book Review in a front page assessment called smart and knowing and absorbing. Tom is the author of 10 books of fiction, including, I guess I shouldn't say it's my favorite because you've got a new book, Henry and Clara, about the ill-fated eyewitnesses to the Lincoln assassination, which became an opera, no less, along with Dewey Defeats Truman, my favorite title, Fellow Travelers, Watergate, and as mentioned, Finale. For those of you who don't know, he's a native of Long Island. It's always hard to do that glissando without saying Long Island. Long Island, a graduate of Brown with a Harvard PhD. He served as literary editor of GQ and contributes still, as I'm sure many of you know, to The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, and other publications. Full disclosure, because I know he might want me to provide it, and I don't want him to take time to provide it on his own. He himself served, I guess, in the Bush administration as Deputy Director for the National Endowment for the Humanities. And fuller disclosure, during that time, I was honored to receive the National Humanities Medal from Tom and President Bush. So one big happy family. And this is a family affair all around. To host the conversation tonight, I'm pleased that the responsibility will fall to our own Roosevelt House programming curator, Bill Goldstein, who knows a thing about fiction writers himself, not only as host of the weekly segment Bill's Books on WNBC TV's Today in New York, but having published the acclaimed 2017 book, The World Broke in Two, about the interconnected lives of Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, and E.M. Forster. And when we presented that book at Hunter College, I think Tom interviewed Bill, so turnabout is fair play. This is such an interlocking directory, I hate to do all of the disclosures. So the program tonight will be as follows. Tom Mallon will read a portion of his new book to you, and following that, assuming this complicated stagecraft works, Bill and Tom will sit at the table and have the conversation that we're all here tonight to observe. So it's a pleasure to welcome Thomas Mallon.
Thank you. Appreciate your coming out. Bill and I thought we'd start by having me read a scene from early in the novel. It features Larry King, the talk show host, and one of his favorite guests, Ann Richards, George W. Bush's predecessor as governor of Texas. I always have a kind of choric character in these books, and I guess she has the Alice Roosevelt Longworth part in an earlier novel about the Watergate scandal. Alice had that duty. Anyway, this particular program and conversation never happened. It's entirely fictional. But the premise is that Richards has been invited on a special late edition of Larry King Live as a commentator on Bush's State of the Union address. And she was one of his favorite guests. It's the evening of February 2, 2005. The president is 2 weeks into his second term. His recent inaugural address was most notable for laying out, despite troubles in Iraq, an assertively interventionist foreign policy, what came to be known as the Freedom Agenda. Bush was also calling for a political risky domestic initiative that would partially privatize the Social Security system. Sorry about that. And I'll sort of point to an imaginary TV when Bush's on-air voice while giving the State of the Union is quoted in the book. Ann Richards, now 71 and 10 years out of politics, took a sip of iced tea. "Are you sure you don't want something else?" a pretty young network assistant asked. "We've got some wine coolers in the fridge." "Oh, honey," replied the former Texas governor, "I'm as dry as shrub there." She pointed to the TV image of George W. Bush making his way down the aisle of the House chamber to deliver his fourth State of the Union message. "A bit more tangy, I hope, but I've got just as firm a seat on the wagon." Larry King opened a can of cream soda. "You're not off salt, too, are you? I'm supposed to watch my intake." He took a handful of pretzel nuggets from a little bowl. Richards had accepted a booking on a special edition of Larry King Live to be broadcast late tonight after the speech was delivered and the network's regular commentators had had their say about it. King occasionally did his show from New York instead of LA and had taken advantage of his East Coast presence tonight to schedule Ann, who'd lived near Lincoln Center for a few years and still did a lot of political consulting for a firm up here. She'd agreed that the two of them would watch the speech together since viewers would expect it to be a big part of their later conversation. "Larry, honey, when we're on the air, you're going to ask me some actual questions, right? Not just say, 'Ann, your take?'" I will strangle you with your suspenders if you don't get at least a little specific. Plenty of questions, I promise, plus your phone calls. The phrasing he always used at the top of the hour had just popped out. I mean, you know, the home audience's calls. Richards looked at the TV screen. This damned event always seemed longer than the Oscars. That's good, King responded. Say that when we're on. She sipped some more tea as Bush mounted the rostrum and shook hands with the rounded forms of Denny Hastert and Dick Cheney. They looked like two of those Russian nesting dolls. Like they're waiting to see which one is going to be asked to encase the other. I do hear that old Denny behaves as if Cheney is his boss. Interesting, said King, before he and Richards and the assistant fell to listening quietly for a few minutes. The president was soon praising a rise in home ownership, and after that, the way his administration had, quote, prosecuted corporate criminals. I always kind of liked Kenny Lay, said Richards, recalling the disgraced boss of Enron. He was pretty square with me, so don't ask me about him when we're in the studio, Larry. Point taken. Bush proceeded to talk about the success of the No Child Left Behind Act, and after that, the wonders of ethanol. King couldn't understand why he was bothering with the latter, since he would never again have to face the voters of Iowa. But his brother might, Richards explained, or some tiny shrub that's still a seed, maybe one of the little brown ones, she added, using 41's awkward term of affection for his half-Mexican grandchildren by Jeb. This dynasty business bother you, Ann? Asked King. She ignored the question, listening to Bush make his pitch for immigration reform. What's all this domestic stuff? She finally asked. Wasn't he saddling up for the Crusades just 2 weeks ago? It does seem like a change of pace. So we must join together to strengthen and save Social Security. Oh, dear God, said the former governor, almost in a whisper, here it comes. Is that disgust I'm hearing? Asked King. Awe? Awe. They say Social Security is the third rail of politics. Here he is, not afraid to touch it. Oh, Larry, he could piss on it and not have enough brain cells to feel himself get electrocuted. By 2033, the trust fund's annual shortfall will be more than $300 billion. By the year 2042, the entire system will be exhausted and bankrupt. He'll be 96, Richards hollered, and still getting a check from his grandpa's trust fund. Quick math, praised King. The two of them could hear boos coming from the Democratic side of the aisle. Turn it up, sweetie, Richards commanded the assistant. I could swear there's hissing, too. I will work with members of Congress to find the most effective combination of reforms. I will listen to anyone who has a good idea to offer. Wasn't that pretty much how he governed in Texas? Asked King. He never governed. Bob Bullock did. Richards embarked on a fast tutorial about the peculiar legislative power reserved to that state's lieutenant governors and how it had been Bullock, a Democrat, who succeeded in pushing Bush's programs through the ledge in Austin. Bullock started out as a mean old segregationist and ended up with even more regrets than ex-wives. By the time Georgie came to town, Bob was a self-pitying wreck who hit on the idea that respectability would descend on him if he made this boy a statewide success and then helped him become president. He could imagine the Medal of Freedom hanging from his neck as easily as I can feel this thing around mine. She raised and let go of the silver and turquoise lavalier she was wearing. Of course, he up and died a year before Shrub made it to Washington. Her voice began to trail off. Bullock was all right to me when I was coming up, but the president was now setting forth the intricacies of personal retirement accounts, which he promised would take the pressure off Social Security. Put this damn thing on mute, said the former governor. The assistant obeyed. How are we going to do our prep? King wondered. Just a little break, said Richards, who swallowed some more tea in the now silent green room. She regarded the televised image of the president, who seemed somehow cut in half, separated from himself by his dark red tie. How's Molly? Asked King softly. Not good, Richards informed him. The cancer's back. The Texas columnist, Molly Ivins, another of Larry's prize guests, had a tongue as sharp as Richards' own. Rough, said King. She's been battling it for years. Still smoking, drinking too. Richards looked away from the screen, shifting her gaze to an unwatered plant not far from the TV. She and Bullock liked each other, even though he called her a hairy-legged liberal. Her expression had turned wistful. She extracted a compact from her purse and looked at her own still beautiful, deeply lined face in the little mirror, which was too small to include her formidably beehived white hair. "Did you ever think he'd get so far?" asked King, eager to change the subject back to Bush. "Was it mostly 'cause of Rove?" "You mean turd blossom. That's what Bush calls him, you know." Richards thought of how the two men, callow candidate and soulless consultant, had quite to her astonishment maneuvered her out of the governor's mansion 10 years before. She had never succeeded in rattling Shrub, who had no more to offer than ownership of a baseball team as his outstanding qualification for the state's top job. She'd pummeled him by the hour, even taunted him in the elevator on the way up to their one debate, sure she could break his drugstore cowboy stride, but nothing had worked. "You know the reason Rove's office in Austin had no windows?" she asked King. "So he could concentrate?" "It was an environmental measure for the protection of the public, so they wouldn't be downwind of him." King laughed. "Remind me who it was you beat the first time." "In '90, Clayton Williams, the richest rancher and most ridiculous fool you ever met. He won his primary by good old boying his opponent. And you know who that was? Little Kent Hance, the only man who ever beat Georgie way back when he ran for Congress in '78. Needless to say, Hance had turned Republican by then. All that part of the state did during Reagan's time. Shrub even moderated a GOP debate between Hance and Clady. You know, Larry, Texas is really just a small town that happens to be the size of France." "I gotta bring us back to the present, Anne." King unmuted the TV. "For the good of families, children, and society, I support a constitutional amendment to protect the institution of marriage." Richards remained silent. How was she supposed to listen to this anti-gay guff without remembering the dyke rumor that Rove had floated past the electorate and her 4 grown kids when he was running young George against her in '94? He'd knocked her so badly off balance that even tonight, 10 years later, she thought it better not to tell Larry she had plans for a ginger ale nightcap with half in, half out of the closet Liz Smith, the New York Post gossip columnist. Taking on gang life will be one part of a broader outreach to at-risk youth, and I am proud that the leader of this nationwide effort will be our First Lady, Laura Bush. "Oh, that'll stop them," Richards cried. "Those Crips are going to be clamoring for library cards from Watts to the south side of Chicago." In a lower, more peevish tone, she told King, "You know, I executed 48 people and had 2 times as many folks in prison when I left Austin as when I got there, but Shrub made me out to be soft on crime, and the voters bought it." The president seemed ready to switch back to foreign affairs. "There are still regimes seeking weapons of mass destruction, but no longer without attention and without consequence." Richards lifted her seat cushion. "Did you lose something?" the assistant asked. "Just checking for WMDs. Any in your chair, hon?" King noticed how a pin she wore glinted when she shifted. Richards could see him peering at it. "Yeah, it's a silver foot." A commemoration, she explained, of the jibe at Bush's father that had made her famous back in '88. Poor George, he can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth. "Did you have it made?" asked King. "Hell no, it was a present from George Herbert Walker himself." "Classy guy," said King. Richards dismissively flicked her wrist. "Up to a point. You can bet that the missus didn't sign the card. She's meaner than Bullock was with a quart of booze inside him. Look around her neck and you'll find all the pearls of wisdom that didn't go to her son." "Funny stuff," said King. "But believe me, he is his mother's son." "She did yell at me once," King remembered, "for not wearing a tie to some White House event. I thought it was informal." Richards gave him an "are you out of your mind" look. The victory of freedom in Iraq will strengthen a new ally in the war on terror, inspire democratic reformers from Damascus to Tehran, bring more hope and progress to a troubled region, and thereby lift a terrible threat from the lives of our children and grandchildren. That inaugural speech of his managed to repel both Jim Baker and Pat Buchanan, Richards noted, referencing endpoints on the Republican spectrum from multilateralist to America First. In the House gallery, after being mentioned by the president, Safia Taleb al-Suhail, an Iraqi woman whose father had been murdered by Saddam Hussein, embraced Mrs. Janet Norwood, the mother of a U.S. Marine Corps sergeant killed in Fallujah. Even the Democrats were on their feet and cheering, though it was mostly Republicans waggling ink-stained thumbs, a gesture of support for the Iraqi elections the administration had just helped to run. "Well, he's good at Skutniks," said Richards. "I'll give him that." "Sputniks?" asked King. "Skutniks," corrected Richards, who told King that these were the ordinary heroes introduced at State of the Union addresses ever since '82, when Reagan had brought along Lenny Skutnik, a schlubby white-collar drone 2 weeks after he dove into the freezing Potomac to rescue a woman from the crash of that Air Florida plane. "Use that on the air," King enthused. "Our viewers will learn something." After a pause, he added, "I wonder if he'll tune us in later." "Skutnik?" asked Richards. "No, Bush." "You are out of your mind, Larry. He'll be in bed 20 minutes from now, maybe even sooner. He's got to get up extra early tomorrow morning for the goddamn national prayer breakfast." King reached for some pretzels. As the cheering subsided and the lawmakers resumed their seats, Richards took advantage of the momentary silence to tell him in a near whisper, "Call Molly sometime or send her an email. She's up half the night at her computer." Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom. It was wonderful reading. Before we get started, I think now my first question has to be, do you read your books aloud to yourself as you're going through them? I mean, the dialogue is so wonderful, and I had no idea that you did so many voices. We really should. Oh. Okay, this good? Yes, I mean, even when it's not dialogue, I think any novelist, any writer of anything, nonfiction as well, it behooves the writer to read things out loud, to hear the rhythms, to hear if it seems to be working or not. And I can't sing, but I do imitations in the shower. That's the only voices I do. Yeah. So, who else in the book, whose voices did you have down and enjoy most writing in?
Oh, well, there's a heavier quotient of fictional characters in this book than in some of the others, and I don't know exactly how they sound. But certainly, I mean, all of the presidents. I mean, I remember sitting here when we talked about the Reagan book, saying, you know, "Well, Bill," to one question or another. But you know, the voices that are familiar, and Ann Richards, I mean, was this kind of fiction is so much easier to write in the age of YouTube and C-SPAN archives. You can listen to your characters till the cows come home, just at the tap of a finger, and you can learn their cadences and so forth that way.
And so obviously you didn't have that same advantage when you were writing Henry and Clara.
No. Actually, the further back you go, the easier it is to write historical fiction. I think some people assume it's more complicated because the period's more remote. We know less about it. But just as the writer knows less about it, so does the reader. And we don't really know how people spoke, how they thought, whatever. So you can get away with things, I think, a little more easily. Whereas if it's history that your readers have lived with you, they're likely to, point out that you've, bobbled the ball somewhere.
Well, let's situate this novel, Landfall, in the sequence of your historical novels. Harold mentioned that your first historical novel was Henry and Clara, about the couple who were with President and Mrs. Lincoln at Ford's Theater. But you've moved closer and closer to the present day, especially with the last two novels, and then the third novel that you've published. Can you talk about sort of what the overarching goal of them has been in your mind? I mean, focusing on the fictional characters and on the presidency.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of them by now, but they they all sort of started one by one. I never thought of these last three, Watergate and then Finale, which is the Reagan novel, and this one as a trilogy until Dan Frank, my longtime editor, began to get me thinking of them as a trilogy. And I said to him, how are we going to have a trilogy where the middle volume is called Finale? And that's a problem for the marketers. But I don't have a project or a thesis about American history. I have strong feelings about events and movements in American history, but I don't say like Gore Vidal I'm not working a thesis the way he was always trying to develop a thesis of the United States as a sort of wayward empire, a country that had lost its way. I think mostly I'm trying to entertain if there's one overarching, theme, maybe it's a phrase that I've never liked. The personal is political. It's a political kind of movement phrase. My friend Christopher Hitchens used to detest this phrase for entirely different reasons from me, but it was a detestation we had in common. Because aside from the fact that I think it's not mentally healthy to politicize every moment of your life, no matter how woke you may be, I think it's in some ways, the way politics operates is almost the opposite. It's the political is personal. And if historical fiction of this kind, political fiction, has any real point to it, I'd say, it's to try to show that politicians and these people who are making history, that all of their personal quirks, all of their personal motivations, agenda, whatever it is, all of those things come into play. And so I don't alter events very much, but I try to dramatize those things, those personal aspects, dramatize them as the cause leading to the effect, with scenes and so forth that could have happened, might have happened, in between the real things.
Well, and this idea of the personal is political or political is personal, you actually give to a character in the book this time, who says it very entertainingly, and for a reason that presumably, or in a situation that is presumably of your imagining. But if you could explain
well,
how you...
half of my imagining. I think you're alluding to a scene between Nancy Reagan and Laura Bush, and that scene, which takes place in May of 2005, she was in town, Nancy, and she was staying at the White House, and there was this plane that had entered the no-fly zone around Washington, and it was a single-engine plane, and it was chased out of the sky very quickly, but Washington went on lockdown for an hour or two, and Bush was out riding his bike in Maryland, and so Laura was left to go down to the, the shelter in the White House basement, which dated from FDR's time, and there was this ratty pull-out couch and so forth down there, so there's this dialogue between Nancy and Laura Bush, and she reflects on that phrase. Actually, now that I'm realizing, it's another scene where she reflects on that phrase with Condi Rice.
Yeah,
in a telephone conversation with Condi Rice. Whereas with Laura Bush, they have this conversation, and Nancy's just reflective about life in general. She says at one point to Laura, when your daughter's had her first facelift, it's really time to let go of things. and Nancy was a character in Finale. She was one of the main characters in the book, but she has some of these choric functions too. She's a little bit like Ann Richards or Alice in the other book.
Right. Well, so we'll come to Nancy Reagan again, I think. But I wanted to talk. You mentioned. You talked about research, and that was one of the questions I had. Two things. You had personal experience of George Bush, working in his administration. Presumably you at least met him several times or knew him. Can you talk about sort of what you learned through research and then what you used of your own personal observation experience of just, I know you worked with Laura Bush on the National Book Festival, I believe.
I didn't work with her personally, but the National Endowment for the Humanities certainly worked with her office. We worked with her office after Hurricane Katrina. We made a lot of emergency grants to museums, libraries, and so forth that were battling things like mold, after the hurricane had come in. I have enormous respect for Mrs. Bush. I don't know her well at all. She actually plugged a couple of my books one night on Larry King Live. And so it all sort of you use whatever you've got. It all comes together.
Did you
But-
go easy on her in this book because of that?
No, but I mean, I don't think I would have needed to go easy on her, because I mean, she's not a big figure in the book. I always have to have a first lady in these books, but this president had a mother who was a first lady too, and Barbara Bush is a bigger character actually in the book than Laura Bush is. But that was another thing that was unusual about this. I mean, obviously, this is the only administration that I had actually participated in. I mean, on the absolute periphery. I mean, I was beyond Pluto, to be the deputy chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It was not exactly the red hot center of the war on terror or anything else. But nonetheless, you see things. You get to know people. The nature of the NEH is that there are functions at the White House and so forth. And I knew a lot of administration people, and a lot of them who did work with the president. I mean, they were able to tell me things, and that added to my picture of George Bush, which I mean, the 98% of it is from the public record, but little bits and pieces one learns from observation and then from things that people tell you.
Well, your Texas accent actually comes with some pedigree, because the beginning of the novel is in 1978, and George Bush's run for Congress, which you mentioned in the section you read, and there's a party that begins the book and introduces both the fictional characters and the historical characters. But you were in Texas, in Lubbock, Texas, in 1978 when this party took place. Can you situate us in Texas?
I was not at this party, but I taught for 1 year. I was 26 years old in the fall of 1978, and I had my first teaching job at Texas Tech in Lubbock, and there was it was the off-year congressional elections, and George W. was the Republican candidate for Congress against a Democrat, a local boy, a graduate of Texas Tech. And I remember the campaign very well. It's not very civic to say in Franklin Roosevelt's house, but I was not registered to vote. It made Lubbock feel as if it would be too permanent if I actually got registered to vote. So although I had a wonderful time there. But I watched politics. I always watch politics, and I remember his commercials. He had just gotten married to Laura, and they were riding around in a pickup truck, and I can remember seeing them on my old black and white TV. Bush ran a respectable race, got somewhere in the mid-40s, and you have to remember, Texas in those days, particularly West Texas, had not turned red yet. It was really still a Democratic country, and there was George Mahon was the congressman who was retiring, and he'd come in with the New Deal in the 30s, and he was an institution and a Democrat. And so it was a very uphill race for Bush, but his father hadn't even been vice president yet. So, but he, even though Bush had a very authentic Texas accent, he had been raised in Midland, they tried to make him out to be a carpetbagger. And, and they constantly brought up Yale and Connecticut and so forth. But there was this party fundraiser at the home of the former mayor of Lubbock, who had been a Republican, and Jim Granberry, who I interviewed for the book. And it was called the Bush Bash. It became known as the Bush Bash. And I went back to Lubbock and I read through all the papers and was in the university archives. And it asked for students to come out. There was an ad in the university paper saying that if they would come out and presumably, lick envelopes or put up signs, whatever, there'd be free beer. And Kent Hance, his opponent, his people got the idea to send this letter out to all of the preachers in town, and they made it sound as if Bush was corrupting the youth of Texas by offering them free beer. And it didn't, I don't think he would have won anyway, but it didn't help. And there was always a mystery about it. When I talked to Jim Granberry, the mayor, I found a woman named Ruth Schermeyer, who had been the Republican county chairman in those days, and she told me that she always thought it was a setup, that it was a dirty trick, a Watergate-style trick perpetrated in this case by the Democrats. But it was very interesting the way it was handled. Bush did not really fight back on it. There's an element of mystery to that because Ken Hance had a financial interest in a bar downtown in Lubbock. Lubbock was, it was dry in terms of you couldn't buy liquor in the stores, but you could buy liquor by the drink. Thank God. That long hair. And Hance had a connection to, I think he may have been the landlord, or partially the landlord, to a bar in town called Fat Dogs, spelled D-A-W-G-S. And Bush's people were saying, well, you've got to point out this hypocrisy. You know, here these preachers are going after you, and Hance, you know, is serving liquor, not just beer. And he had a great reluctance to do that, Bush. And I think he thought, because I think he knew Hance was going to live there for the rest of his life, and he probably wasn't. And he did not have a taste for that kind of politics. He clearly developed a much rougher style as time goes on. I mean, the campaign between him and John McCain, say, in 2000, the primary campaign was bitter and nasty. But he was quite reluctant at the time. And he was a very issue-oriented politician in the race that he ran. It was a very creditable, informed race. They were both pretty good candidates.
Well, so how did you decide to set this novel about the Bush presidency in 2005 and 2006? I mean, were you at first drawn to the run-up to the Iraq War, to anything about 2000? I mean, obviously Katrina is at the heart of this book. But how did you pinpoint what it was you wanted to focus on in the 8 years as a prism?
You know, in terms of, I mean, historical fiction, political fiction tends to be on the fat side. It's a little bit blousy as a genre. People sort of expect larger books, and I've learned that sort of 1 to 2 years. For me, it seems to be a good narrative pacing. And I don't know, those years, I mean, I've sort of accidentally become the bard of Republican catastrophe. And, you know, Watergate was about a year and a half, 2 years really, from the burglary to the resignation. The Reagan book is a somewhat shorter period. But all of these presidents, these three presidents, they're all shown at the lowest point in their political fortunes. 86 for Reagan, Watergate obviously for Nixon. And with Bush, 2005, 2006, well, they were also the years that I was most in the government. I had a minor post on the NEH Council, which actually I had to go through Senate confirmation for, which was a uniquely interesting experience.
Was it on the order of the Kavanaugh hearings?
No, it just,
Anything,
for such a
skeletons?
tiny, minuscule part-time job, but, you know, the FBI comes to your house and they ask you all these questions. The paperwork, you know, took forever.
So nobody testified against you.
And actually, the job, once I was full-time at the endowment, did not require confirmation, the deputy chairmanship. It was only these little advisory things. Yeah, the wisdom of the federal government. But as Reagan might say, where was I? I had a point to make, and I'm
about
trying to
choosing
remember
2005 and 2006.
And I thought in some ways that was the lowest point because if you read George Bush's memoirs, I mean, he talks about how once it's set in how bad Katrina was, he had intimations that his presidency was really over, that his chance to, to have the domestic presidency, which is what he had wanted, was never going to come to pass. And then, was setting up for the 2006 elections when he lost the Congress. And when he lost the House and Nancy Pelosi became Speaker for the first time, he said it was a thumping. In those days, we did have presidents who, whether you liked them or not, were in touch with reality, and they knew how to call a thumping as opposed to a tremendous victory. But I figured that this was I think this was a terrible kind of crucible for him. I think that Iraq had obviously gone wildly wrong, and I think it was an agony for him. And so I think for those reasons, and also those were the 2 years of the 8 that he was in there that I knew the most about.
And what I'm very intrigued by is how carefully structured all your novels are. I mean, with very clear timelines as we move through them, even though we're moving back and forth between the fictional story of the fictional characters, in this case, a young couple or young when they meet at the Bush Bash, and then what happens to them in ensuing years, that their stories are playing out they are playing out on the same dateline that history is playing out on. And I wonder how you really so wonderfully maneuver the fictional characters, or maybe maneuver the historical characters, so that crises are occurring both in the public and private sphere at the same time. I mean, it's really magical the way you get the fictional characters in the same rhythm or along the same pace as you do the historical timeline.
Well, with this book, I wanted to do something that seemed a little counterintuitive when I was envisioning it. To have these two characters who meet as teenagers. They meet at the Bush Bash, and they have this teenage romance. They have their first kiss on Buddy Holly's grave, which was, aside from the Prairie Dog Village, that was the main tourist attraction in Lubbock. And then they meet up years later, by which time the male, Ross Weatherall, is working at what I call in the book the NEAH. I sort of combine the two endowments. That's as much liberty as I've ever taken with history. Because I needed to get him down to New Orleans for an extended period of time. Allison is an Army lawyer, and she's been in both Afghanistan and Iraq. And Donald Rumsfeld, who's a kind of gnomic, unsettling character in the book, he kind of insinuates her onto the National Security Council staff as a kind of thought experiment. And what I wanted to do was have these two characters in the course of this tumultuous book sort of change sides. Ross, the young man, he's a true believer in Bush, who becomes wildly disillusioned because of his extended experience in New Orleans. And Allie starts out as a tremendous, contemptuous skeptic of Bush in the Iraq War. But in the course of the 2 years, certain things she sees and experiences, particularly the war crimes trial of Saddam Hussein, convince her that something good has to come out of this, and that the Americans need to stay until things are on a better footing there. So she, in effect, becomes switches sides and becomes more pro-Bush. And Bush, meanwhile, for reasons that I hope are credible and plausible, takes an interest in the two of them and in their private problems. And they're kind of, they represent his catastrophes sort of writ small, and he tries to intervene in a couple of ways, in a personal way with them.
And were you, I mean, given that you've given the character Ross something of what your job was, I mean, or at least involved with the organization and then a role in Katrina, I mean, is his political shift something that you experienced also? I mean, about Katrina and your feelings about the Bush administration?
No, I will say, where the NEH was concerned during Katrina, if I may use the phrase, we did a heck of a job. We got a lot of money down there quickly. The idea of sending a lot of government money down to Louisiana without a lot of review and the normal grant safeguards and review process was a little bit daunting, thinking some of it might disappear. But we got it down there very fast, and I think we accomplished quite a lot. Obviously, the response of the administration as a whole was not so good. No, my politics, I mean, I have always been, not always, but for most of my life, been a libertarian kind of Republican, was never a social issues Republican for all the obvious reasons. I disagreed with the president on all kinds of things. I served as an openly gay man in the administration, did not believe in the marriage amendment, nor did the vice president in the administration. But no, I thought that the administration's failures were painful and conspicuous, but I think during this extended national emergency we had, I have, I have no regrets about, serving in the administration. I mean, nothing ever broke my heart politically until 2016, and I think because I mean my politics are somewhat different from most of my friends, so I think I sort of have a kind of niche misery about what's going on now, and but no, I think one wishes that things had turned out better than they did. Certainly in Iraq and in all kinds of places.
Well, that brings me, what you just said, I mean, brings me to a question about when you conceived this book, it was shortly after, I guess, or while you were finishing Finale. So that was under one presidential administration, and then you wrote it and have published it while we are living under a different presidential administration. And I wonder how the heartbreak, as you put it, of 2016 affected what you were doing in the novel, what you thought you would do in the novel, and then how the novel took shape in the end.
I think I tried to prevent that from happening as much as I could, because the tendency, it's like, do you ever get up from the dinner table and after, you've had dinner with several people and you've been there for an hour and a half and you rise and then somebody says, "We never talked about Trump," and it's because it happens so rarely now. And I didn't want to see everything through the Trump lens. I really didn't want to do that. So I had to kind of keep that at bay. But it was hard to. I mean, the office I used to have when I was at the NEH was in the old post office in Washington, which was built during the McKinley administration. And I had this enormous, beautiful office with these half-moon windows. It looked exactly like it had looked in 1896 when the building opened. And, this is now the Trump International Emollients Hotel. And, the endowments have moved out, obviously. They're in a very nondescript office building elsewhere in Washington. And, somebody told me, an old colleague, that, well, what your old office looks like now. And he described it to me, as if it looked like one of Saddam Hussein's bathrooms. And, gold leaf everywhere. I think it's some sort of conference room, whatever. And I used to love to go into that office in the daytime. We had an underemployed intern one time, and we sent her to just research the history of the building, to give her something to do. And I discovered when she came back with the plans for the building from the National Archives that my office had in those days belonged to the superintendent of rate increases for the post office, and which didn't sound like a tremendously taxing job. Should we go from 1 penny to 2 cents? I don't know. I'll go to lunch and think about it later.
Well, before we go to questions from the audience, I mean, we've only scratched the surface of the humor and also the depth of insight and emotion in this book. But
If I could interrupt for 1 second, that when you're talking about the humor and the emotions of it, I have not furthered this impression by reading what I did of the, but of the 3 novels, this is by far the saddest. Because I had always hoped things would turn out better than they did in those 8 years, because there are certain things about those years that I was proud of. I mean, Ali's experiences in Afghanistan. I mean, I went to Afghanistan for all of a week, with a little delegation, and there were things of such consequence that broke my heart during the administration. But it's by far the saddest of the 3 books. Even though the reviews have emphasized the comic aspects of it, and I obviously have emphasized those 2 tonight. Anyway, having interrupted you,
well, I mean, it's just not only is there humor, but everyone is remarkably catty. I mean, it doesn't. It's not only Ann Richards. I mean, Condoleezza Rice and Don Rumsfeld. I mean, they really go at it. I mean, and that's leaving aside that Condoleezza Rice actually has an affair with the Canadian foreign minister in this book. So she's going
there
at
were
it in many
rumors
ways.
at the time.
So-
But I think one of the things too that I've done when I've written these books is, there's the Watergate phrase, "follow the money." If you want to figure out the scandal, I think one of the first things to do with any political novel based on real life politics is to make a list, either on paper or in your head, who hated whom. Because in any administration, many people dislike other people in the administration intensely, and that motivates a tremendous amount of what goes on in terms of infighting. So a lot of this book, for instance, concerns the obvious tensions between Condoleezza Rice and Don Rumsfeld. So, you just make drama out of these things.
Well, and a lot of people seem to really hate Karen Hughes too. So that was a name from the past I hadn't really recollected recently. But
I thought that was a disappointing appointment. When in the second administration, Karen Hughes, who had been the president's longtime counselor, became the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. I thought we could have used a more robust appointee in that job, because public diplomacy was absolutely crucial. I mean, that was one of the things we were doing on something like that little trip to Afghanistan. And, I didn't think it was enough to have people going abroad and saying, well, I'm going to talk to them as a mom. The times were too dark and the demands were too urgent for that.
well, I won't go through all of the 10 or 12 items I have about details in the book that are so wonderful. So I'll do it a very abbreviated version of this before we go to questions from the audience. But there are just some things that were so startlingly real that I wondered if you had made them up or if they really were true. The first one was, does Laura Bush really call George Bush Bushy?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I feel like I should have a clicker here. True.
It's like Jeopardy. Did George Bush really have an email address? G94b@AOL.com?
True.
Oh, and so I suppose he doesn't use it anymore.
No.
Because we all could use it then. Did John Edwards really have a mole removed from his upper lip and then
No.
have it surgically reimplanted after Donatella Versace told him she had a doctor in Milan who could
No.
do that for him? That was
But that was
wonderful.
based on, they're together at a party at Christopher Hitchens. And I did once meet Donatella Versace at a party at Christopher Hitchens. And I thought, how can I not use that in some way? So I imagine, some of these encounters are like those old Max Beerbohm cartoons where, we would imagine these encounters between writers that had never actually happened. But he did not have a little mole, and therefore did not have it replaced.
Okay. It seemed so perfect for what you describe and reveal as his plastic, candidacy personality. I was struck, did Laura Bush really give Condoleezza Rice an e-reader loaded with 6 novels?
No.
That was wonderful. She wants her to read more, and
that was the last minute crisis with this book. If the more that you get the small things right in books like this, the more you can get away with where the big things are concerned. Right. John Updike describes fiction as a sort of tissue of microscopic accuracies, and it always sounds silly to people, but I spend a couple of months fact-checking these books after they're written, and I draw up these long lists and this big manifest, and I check over 1,000 items. And one of the things that got by me when the book was up to second proofs was this Kindle that Laura gives to Condi Rice. I have her doing it about a year before Kindle was on the market. So I got in touch with Alti Carper, who's the production person at Pantheon, and whom I drive crazy every 3 years. And I said, is it too late? Is it too late? I'm always doing this. And we managed to change Kindle to e-reader, which fit, because there were other e-readers on the market, but not Kindles. But to answer your question, no, that did not happen.
Well, I love that detail, and that one of the novels we learn is The Prime Minister by Anthony Trollope. So clearly she was trying to give a political education to Condoleezza Rice that Condoleezza Rice couldn't get on her own. The last question I will ask is, did the Bushes really have a cat that they called India, but that in public was referred to as Willie for the sake of political correctness?
More or less true. I'm going to get this wrong. It was called Willie for a while because India, it was a black cat, and there were demonstrations against it somewhere on the subcontinent. But it was actually named for one of Bush's ball players, Indio. I'm not even getting the name right. Ruben Indio, I believe. But at a certain point, the cat was publicly referred to as something else. But it was always India. It was a completely innocent name. There was another cat that they had. I believe his name was Ernie. And when they moved to the White House, one of the president's speechwriters, Matt Scully, was a fervent animal rights activist, and I believe this. He told me this story that he had asked about Ernie. He had been concerned that Ernie hadn't come to the White House, and I believe that Bush said to him, like, Matt, Ernie's okay. He's got a good home. I hear he's dating.
Well, on that note, we will go to your questions. But thank you, Tom Mallon, for the book and for this conversation. So please, we'll have microphones coming around here. Oh, wait for the mic. Oh, can you pass it along?
Hi, I've really enjoyed your books. In the first chapter, when he's running for Congress, at the house party, Bush alludes to having a couple of beers. I thought he had quit drinking early on. Was he still drinking, and how serious was it?
Well, that scene in '78, Bush is only 32 at that time. We've had 3 presidents born in 1946, Bill Clinton, Bush, and the incumbent. And it was really when he turned 40, which would have been 1986, that he stopped drinking hard and fast.
Back, also on the aisle.
Thank you. In what ways do you, or do you at all, research your fictional characters?
Well, if you, I do sort of draw up what almost look like CVs for them, you know, where they were born, when they were born, where they went to school, what jobs they had, and to research. I know what you mean by the question. Allison O'Connor, who is the woman I was talking about, the Army lawyer who winds up on the NSC staff. The kind of research there is, well, what would that job entail? And would it be plausible for her to get that job in the circumstances that I have her getting it? And there you, the way you would research anything, I mean, a fellow named Will Inboden was very helpful to me, who had been on the NSC staff and runs the Clements Center for National Security down in Austin now, and met with him and talked a little bit about Allie's career. So the answer is yes. I mean, you have to do that kind of research for it.
Thank you.
Over here.
When and if in the future you might consider writing fiction about the guy who you referred to as the incumbent, what special challenges have you thought that might involve?
Well, which low point would you choose? That's what you seem to.
I think the chief one would be nausea. But I will not do that ever, never, never, never. I mean, my only goal is to survive this, not to chronicle it. I actually wrote something about this a couple of years ago. I did a piece for the New Yorker called Presumptive, and it was not fiction, it was nonfiction, but it was about how you would turn the 2016 campaign into a novel. What you would do, and what the difficulties might be, and so forth. And like everybody else, I imagined that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. But I did talk about the challenges of making the main characters into point of view figures, as they say in the creative writing biz. And she would be a gold mine. I mean, conflicted, many admirable qualities that she's constantly compromising. She's straight out of American literature. She's Carol Kennicott in Sinclair Lewis, or English literature. She's even Sue Brighthead in Jude the Obscure. I mean, there are a million different Hillarys that have been suited up and sent out into battle over the years. But the other one, I mean, just this gaseous cyclone of self-regard. I mean, I could not spend time there. I spent 3 entirely happy years in the psyche of Richard Nixon. I don't know what that says about me, but I used to think, how does, Bob Caro spend decades on Lyndon Johnson? And I kind of understood that after Nixon. There was always something interesting, heartbreaking, just deep and deep and deep, no matter how many layers you peeled back that repaid you as a writer when you're writing about him. But I couldn't do this. There was a review of the book, that Times review, which sort of imagined that, oh well, I guess he'll be turning to Trump next, and I got an email from my friend Christopher Buckley, the novelist, and he said, "Don't you dare." He says, "I'm 23,000 words in." And his working title is "Make Russia Great Again." And I said, "It's all yours."
With respect to your living non-fictional characters, as you're writing, are you thinking at all about what they're going to think about when they read?
Occasionally, and there were, because this is so close to us in time as opposed to the other one. Even with Finale, most of the figures were gone. It crosses your mind, but the vast majority of them will not read the book, and you can't really. That could become paralyzing. The books do get lawyered, and fortunately in America we have a very high tolerance for anything to be said about public figures. Much better legal apparatus here, I think, than in the UK, for instance. So writers are given, at least for now, since we hear this talk of was retribution, or there'll be retaliation or something. So writers do have a lot of freedom, and I think you try to just put that out of your mind. Same way, people writing nonfiction, profile writers and biographers and so forth of living figures. I think that thought crosses their minds while they're writing, but they simply have to banish it, and you have to say, I'm not writing this for that person as the audience. I can't do that. I have, this somewhat abstract audience in my head, but it's got to be for them. I also don't, I never think of any of these books as being mean toward almost anybody. I up until 2 years ago always enjoyed politics, and the whole carnival aspect of it, it was always a pleasure. And I think as a novel is inherently empathetic. You have to have empathy for the person if you're going to make that person a point of view character. And I look back on the books that I've written. I don't even think I'm very mean toward John Wilkes Booth, in Henry and Clara, because when you have to get into the head of that character, you've got to find a way to operate with a certain degree of sympathy or even identification, up to a point. So I just try to push that off to the side.
Yeah, we have time for 2 more questions. Ma'am.
I became a fan when I read Henry and Clara, and I wonder if you think about delving back into the past. They were tangential to Lincoln's life, but there's so many wonderful characters in history, and you wouldn't have the problem of dealing with living people and their reactions.
I'm actually signed up to write 2 more novels. After that, we already have a plot in Rock Creek Cemetery where I can join all of these characters. 2 books will take me into my 70s, and I think that'll be enough. And one of them, I'm taking a break from politics for a while. I'm writing a novel about a real-life actor who was murdered in New York in 1980, which is a kind of one-off production for me. But I am going to go back to the Civil War one more time. I have plans to write a novel about Fort Sumter and the months leading up to Fort Sumter. I pushed that back. I'm doing the other one first, and I think some of it is to take a break from politics, even politics that far back. And Also, I think it would be very tricky to write this novel now in what is such a vexed period where the Civil War is concerned. I sort of, maybe when the statues come down, and, you know, this is such a current thing right now. And to write, again, the empathy question, to write a novel about that set of circumstances in that period, there would necessarily be a quotient of sympathetic Confederate characters, along with presumably despicable ones, and along with the admirable characters on the other side. And I think the current debate about Confederate history and how we're going to handle that, I think that would be hovering over me, sort of like that other question, you know, what about the real life people? And I think that I'm not sure I really want to see that book I have in mind through the contemporary lens, which I think would be very difficult not to do in the current very interesting period of debate about those things.
One more question.
What gave you the idea to become the kind of historical novelist that you have become? Because when you were going to college and after, the historical novel didn't have a lot of literary cred. I mean, the great exception was Gore Vidal, who's everybody's great exception, and also E.L. Doctorow. It was all about metafiction and dirty realism. Where did the germ of this the kind of novel that you write come from?
I think part of it has to do with not having wanted to write about my own life, which has been perfectly happy but sort of placid. And I don't think anybody wants to read it refracted into fiction, which is not to say that all fiction is an refracted autobiography, but I just thought the stories I could find in history were better than the stories that were mine or that, you know, I was sort of living with. And I loved politics from the start. The Kennedy-Nixon election of 1960 was my first real political experience. I went to school every day with a Nixon button on, which pleased my father, who had been an ardent New Dealer, like Ronald Reagan, and then had traveled that route rightwards. But I think one of the things you mentioned, Gore Vidal, who I knew when I was at GQ. I edited Gore. You've had the pleasure, I think, of doing the same thing. And I worked on some magazine pieces with him, and he gave me good advice about historical fiction. And one of the reasons it was easier, I think, to write historical fiction now is that he made the genre, which had been something of a white elephant, you know, these costume dramas that were not really thought of as literary fiction. He had restored the genre to a kind of literary respectability by introducing wit into it and learning and so forth. And he gave me good advice, including, I'm talking about these two last novels to write, good advice, I think, about when to stop. I once had a phone call from him. I was on the phone with him, I can't remember, we were editing or something, and he had sent me his last novel. And he said to me, well, you know, this will be the last one. And I said something like, oh, surely not, Gore, you know, why? And he said, well, get to the end of a chapter, don't remember how it began.
Well, on that note, thank you, Tom Mallon. We will have a reception upstairs and a book signing, and you can ask Tom your questions at the reception and signing. Thank you, Tom Mallon.